Hi, I'm Don Sundman, and welcome to the next installment of the story of the 1 cent Z-Grill. So I had the stamp now, and I wanted to show it to collectors everywhere. I was so excited when I saw it in 1997 at a stamp show in New York City that I brought my kids to the show, and I said, this stamp is important. It's really famous. I'd never seen it before. Most collectors have never seen it. It had spent almost all its life in private collections and wasn't displayed to the public. And so I wanted to take it out to stamp shows and show it to collectors everywhere. So we made up a display, and then we also, so it showed like the front of the stamp with its distinctive cancel and the grill on the back, and somebody had written the Scott number in pencil on the stamp and other markings. And we created a little booklet with information about the stamp. And then I would take it to stamp shows. Because I'm a stamp dealer, I had to offer the stamp for sale. And so I was thinking, what do you price it at? And I thought, well, I would have paid $1.5 million. That was my top bid. So it's worth all of that because I would have paid that. And I thought, well, maybe $2 million is a reasonable price. And then somebody told me about gee whiz marketing, that if I asked a higher price, somebody might go, gee whiz, that's a lot of money for an old 1 cent stamp. So I decided to price it at $2.5 million. And I created an ad, ran it in Lynn Stamp News, had a coupon in the ad, and it said, here's my check for $2.5 million, send me the 1 cent Z-Grill. And I remember the editor of Lynn's, Mike Lawrence, just thought that was so funny because it was similar to ads we'd run in the Sunday newspapers if somebody wanted to order like 10 old U.S. stamps or 100 mint U.S. stamps. Then in 1999, there was a company called Collectors Universe, and they were starting a business of grading postage stamps. And part of that was they sealed it inside a hard plastic shell. It was similar to the shell they used to grade baseball cards. So it's about that size. And because the 1 cent Z-Grill was the most valuable stamp and really unique, they wanted that to be the very first stamp that was graded. And so I agreed, and they encapsulated the stamp for me. And then that turned out to have another side benefit because the stamp was really protected. And so I could lend it to the American Philatelic Society and let other people hold it at company meetings. I'd pull it out, and our colleagues would be able to hold the stamp that was worth over $1 million. So it was really thrilling. The summer of 2000, the Postal Service put on a big show out in Anaheim, California, near Disneyland. And I offered to put the stamp on display. And so I must have given it to, I think, to the Bob Lamb at the American Philatelic Society, because when I showed up at the show, the stamp was already there and there was a display. And there was this gigantic man, a former wrestler called Hillbilly Jim. And he would come to stamp shows and work for a friend of his, Arthur Morwitz, and he thought that was fun to go to stamp shows. When he was Hillbilly Jim, loved the 1 cent Z-Grill, and he would go by every day and look at the stamp. He just found it fascinating. It was so valuable and so tiny. And so I've got a photo with Jim. He now has a radio show in Outlaw Country on Sirius Satellite Radio. Around 2000 or 2002, Japanese TV decided to do a segment on my son buying the stamp. And they came over here, or hired people in the U.S., and they went up to Mystic, and they had this giant tour bus, like a Trailways bus for just a few people. And they, 4 or 5 people that were in the crew. And so they interviewed me at the office at Mystic, and then they went to our house, and when my son was out of school, they interviewed him, and that aired on Japanese TV. So it was fun that the stamp would get attention all over the world. The stamp was also in a couple of TV shows as a thing of value that criminals were trying to steal. And so that was exciting to own a stamp that is in popular culture and TV shows. In 2002, there was a stamp show in Atlantic City, a APS stamp show. And so I lent the stamp, the 1 cent Z-Grill, to the show, and they set up the display. And the planning for the show, a friend of mine, Sam Malamud, represented many countries that produce stamps a lot of topical stamps and interesting stamps. And there's a country that is issuing a set of stamps for Heidi Klum, who is a model, and she's gone on to great fame and television success after that. But she was young, it was early in her career. And Sam asked me to present her some stamps. He wanted to have a ceremony. And he said, your kids will know who she is. Have some of your kids come and present the stamps. And so I went with my daughter, Emily, and we put together a stamp album, and it had the world's first stamp, the penny black, and the first U.S. stamp, and it had a German stamp, the first stamp after reunification, and some other stamps. Heidi Klum was German. Anyway, she just thought this album was great. It turned out her dad collected stamps, and so she had grown up around stamps, and she understood the collector mentality and how they're interested in these products. So after we had the presentation and then Heidi signed autographs, Sam asked me if I would take her to the show. And so I took her over to see our 1 cent Z-Grill, and she was so excited, genuinely excited to see this rare, valuable stamp. And so that was a lot of fun. So as I said before, Bill Gross was building this fabulous stamp collection, a complete collection of U.S. stamps. I didn't realize it at the time, but when I bought the 1 cent Z-Grill. But he was still interested in that stamp, and Charles Shreve was his advisor. Well, Charles joined the Smithsonian National Postal Museum Council of Philatelists, and I was on the council. And so we became friends, and we would talk at the meetings. And so from time to time, Charles would mention that Mr. Gross still had an interest in the stamp if I was interested in selling it. But I really loved the stamp, and I told Charles that, Bill Gross had all these fabulous stamps, and I had this one really special stamp, and I wanted to keep my stamp, and so I really wasn't interested in selling it at that time. But I didn't realize that Bill Gross tells the story on tape at the Postal Museum, that how he had this goal to have the complete collection, and he needed 4 stamps and 3 stamps and 2 stamps and then just 1 stamp. Well, that was my stamp. So he was really motivated to get that stamp. Well, at that time I thought, well, the stamp isn't for sale, so I should tell people it's not for sale. So I ran an ad in Lynn Stamp News saying it's withdrawn from sale, that I may sell it in the future, but right now it's not for sale. And I thought about it, that if I sold the stamp, I would have to pay taxes, and then I'd have to buy another stamp that was equally desirable, and I didn't know what that was. And so it seemed to me it would come out behind instead of ahead if I actually sold the stamp. So I thought, I'll just keep this stamp. It was great. It was fun to take to shows, and it got us a lot of attention. Well, Charles told Bill that story, and Bill came up with the idea that maybe I would trade it for something else fantastic. And so, we know he's a financial genius. And so a trade deferred the taxes until I actually sold the object that was traded. So Bill suggested that he buy the Jenny plate block, which was coming up at auction, and trade it for the 1 cent Z-Grill. And then he was also saying, trying to make a sales pitch, as a stamp dealer, I should refresh my inventory. And I'd had that 1 cent Z-Grill for quite a few years. So the idea grew on me, and then Charles and I talked about it. It was a big decision for me. So I said I wanted the right of first refusal when Bill sold the stamps. I wanted his stamp collection in the future. I wanted the chance to buy that stamp back. But then we realized that wasn't practical. How could you value the stamp in 10 or 20 years? And it just, so we stopped doing that. So at the end, we agreed to a simple trade. If Bill bought the Jenny plate block, we would just trade them. So Charles, acting on behalf of Bill, did buy the Jenny plate block at auction. And some people were surprised that I didn't show up at the auction and didn't place a bid for the Jenny plate block. But a week later, we announced that we planned to trade the stamps in what the New York Times called the stamp trade of the century. And in that article, I told the Times that I saw the 1 cent Z-Grill as the Hope Diamond of American philately. And I really do. It's really unique and special. It's really a fantastic stamp. So we had a ceremony at Charles' office in Manhattan. And Alan Kane, who is executive director of the Smithsonian National Postal Museum, was there, and the curator from the Postal Museum was there, chairman of the Philatelic Foundation, George Kramer, and many other luminaries, famous collectors, and the media was there. TV was there, radio, newspapers, lots of photographers. So it was pretty exciting. After the trade, Charles had champagne, so we had a glass of champagne and people chatted, and it was kind of a heady experience. It was a lot of fun. Well, then National Public Radio contacted us, and they wanted to do a radio interview. And so I went to their studios in Manhattan, and the people from the All Things Considered radio show were in, I think, Washington, D.C. And so we did a remote radio interview. And that recording's on the internet. If you want to hear it, you can Google All Things Considered, Donald Sundman, stamp trade, and you'll find it. And the story got worldwide attention, the stamp trade, much more than I ever expected. Somebody gave me a Chinese newspaper, and I think it was on the front page of this Chinese newspaper. So all around the world, the story really captivated people's attention, and they thought it was a lot of fun. And then a few years later, at the opening of the Gross Stamp Gallery at the Smithsonian Postal Museum, I was talking with Bill Gross about the trade, and Bill said that he thinks that collectors will still be talking about that trade 50 years after it happened. And I think he's right. I think it's one of the greatest stories in the stamp world. So later, I'll create another video and I'll talk about the Jenny plate block and what we did with that after trading for the 1 cent Z-Girl.